Welcome back to the Dr. Greg Jones Optimization Academy. In today's episode, we're talking all about compound pharmacies with my guest, Tanille Davis. Tanille is a board-certified sterile compound pharmacist. She's the Chief Advocacy Officer for the Alliance of Pharmacy Compounding, and she spent 16 years leading Civic Center Pharmacy in Scottsdale, Arizona. Today's episode, we're going to talk about compound pharmacies, the regulations that determine what they can and can't do, and how that impacts patients, practitioners, and pharmacists alike. Let's unpack compound pharmacies and learn more about it. So welcome to the show, Tanille.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad you made time for this. I know we've been trying to do this forever.
We have for like a year.
Maybe longer, maybe 4 years.
Yeah, maybe.
It's like, hey, I got this new podcast. I got this new podcast. You want to do it? So let's talk about how you got here, as in, where you went to pharmacy school at. Did you start in commercial pharmacies? And
Sure.
What was your journey from there to now?
Yeah, my very first job was actually in a pharmacy. Okay. I was 15 years old, and my mom played bunco with a woman whose husband owned an independent pharmacy. Okay. And they were looking for what they called at the time an after-school girl to come after high school and, put away the order, do some filing, just kind of miscellaneous tasks. But I came into this mom and pop pharmacy and I really liked it. I'd always been really good at math and science, but I'd never really intended to go into a math and science career. Right. I was the yearbook editor when I was in junior high and high school, so I was expected to do something more creative, more related to writing. But anyway, so I started in this pharmacy, really liked it, decided to go to pharmacy school. I went to Idaho State University. I'm from Idaho, and they had a kind of fast track program if you knew what you wanted to do. So that's what I did. I did pharmacy school, got a doctorate in 6 years, graduated when I was 22, almost 23. Right. And at the time, when I graduated pharmacy school in 2005, there's a huge pharmacist shortage in the country. And, they were offering huge sign-on bonuses, leases to BMWs, all the stuff to try to get pharmacists in these markets that were really short. So at the time, it was kind of between Phoenix and Seattle, the two markets that had real big shortages and, big sign-on bonuses. And I just flipped a coin and ended up in Phoenix, thinking I would be here for only a couple of years. And that was 2005, and I'm still here like 20 years later. So yeah, so after pharmacy school, I worked in like a traditional type of, retail corporate pharmacy for a couple of years. And then I got a job at Civic Center Pharmacy in Scottsdale, which was a sterile and non-sterile compounding pharmacy. That kind of independent pharmacy was always my passion. I like the family-oriented part of it. So I came to work for them. I worked there for 16 years. My boss, the owner, his name was Ari. He was great. He unfortunately passed away from cancer in 2014. I took over as the pharmacist in charge, which is essentially kind of the manager of the company at that time. And then I worked there until this year. I actually recently left and took a job as the Chief Advocacy Officer for the Alliance for Pharmacy Compounding, which is the national trade association that represents compounding pharmacists and compounding in the country. So I'm doing advocacy work, setting up visits on Capitol Hill, talking with legislators, senators, and then also kind of dealing with issues as they arrive that affect compounding pharmacists, in Arizona and all over the country.
Oh, that's really, really cool. So our first question, did you get the BMW?
I took the cash instead of the BMW lease, but I bought myself a BMW.
Smart woman right there. It's like, they're going to dangle that Beamer in front of you. It's probably like a 98. Like, yeah, come get this 98 BMW. And now you're out of the pharmacy. You're out of the clinical side of the house too,
I'm
right?
still doing consulting for Civic Center Pharmacy. So I'm still around a little bit, just not inside all day, every day like I used to be. Mm-hmm. So I'm doing kind of more advocating for the entire industry rather than I've always done advocacy inside of Arizona. Mm-hmm. Kind of trying to band Arizona compounding pharmacists together. I always said, we want to work together to tackle these issues. Let's not act as competitors. Let's band together. And we did. Arizona pharmacists actually were one of the groups that went to USP when they originally wrote the changes to their chapters in 2019 and filed an appeal, and our appeal was granted, so that we were the only state organization, the only state group that did an appeal. But so we've been doing this for a while. I just am now doing it on a national scale.
Okay. And we're going to talk more about that too, like your transition, and actually not so much the transition, but like what you're actually doing and stuff. That's a little bit later. But so it's kind of a great segue here, because one of the first questions, and just, even before becoming a physician and just going through med school, and, it's like, as a patient, it's like, hey, you go to your doctor, he writes a prescription, you go to Walgreens, you get your medication, you get a refill every now and then, you take it from there. If there's some interactions, the pharmacist talks to you about that. So for most people, like, you don't even know that there is a compounding pharmacy, or you don't even know that there's pharmacies in the hospital. So when I was getting ready for this, and it was like educating myself, because I was like, okay, I know there's commercial, I know there's compounding, but there's also the clinical side of it. So kind of talk through the difference between a clinical pharmacy, in a hospital setting versus your commercial CVS, Walgreens, Target kind of thing, and a compound pharmacy.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's actually even more types of pharmacies than that. There's a lot of different ways to practice pharmacy if that's the career path that people choose. Mm-hmm. What most people think of when they think of pharmacy is they think of like their corner corporate drugstore where they can pick up a gallon of milk, get their prescription filled, get a Mother's Day card, all of those things in one spot. That's only a portion of the pharmacies in our country. Like you said, hospital pharmacies exist. If you've ever been in a hospital or seen a patient in a hospital with an IV bag connected to them, that was made by a pharmacist in the hospital pharmacy. Hospital pharmacists also have tons of clinical pharmacists. So those are ones that aren't necessarily in the pharmacy per se. They're usually working on the floors as part of the medical team, helping make decisions, say, for dosing of antibiotics or screening for drug-drug interactions, and helping direct the care of the patient from the medication side. There's long-term care pharmacists. So if you've ever had a loved one in a assisted living facility or a nursing home, those medications are typically filled by what's called long-term care pharmacies. They'll put medications in kind of those big blister things that nurses will pop out the patient's daily dose. Those are long-term care pharmacies. Those pharmacies also do chart reviews of patients to make sure that they aren't prescribed any drugs that could increase their risk of falls, because they're typically elderly patients. And then kind of my wheelhouse is compounding pharmacy. And a lot of people in our country have never heard of a compounding pharmacy, or will never hear of one until they need one. But what a compounding pharmacy is essentially a pharmacy that mixes things from scratch. It's kind of the traditional version of pharmacy if you think about the olden days and going to like a soda fountain pharmacy with a mortar and pestle, crushing up medicinal herbs. That's traditional pharmacy that evolved eventually into compounding. Nice. So we take active pharmaceutical ingredients and mix them together with excipients or flavor, whatever we need to make it into a finished dosage form based on a doctor's prescription. Some patients either can't tolerate or take a commercially available product due to allergies, sensitivities. They need a different dose. They need a different route. They can't swallow a tablet. Or the patient needs a compounded medication because the FDA-approved version is not available. So compounders can make a compounded prescription if the FDA-approved medication is not appropriate for a patient or not available for a patient. Right. But we don't do anything without a prescription. A prescription always comes first. So a provider determines that a customized medication is appropriate for their patient and writes a customized prescription that gets then sent to the pharmacy, like what I worked for.
So one thing you kind of mentioned, and this is a great question, because working with compound pharmacies, a lot of docs know, hey, if I have a question about the medication or how to dose it or interactions or side effects, you can call the compound pharmacy and speak to the pharmacist, right? And like you said, when you're in a hospital setting, the pharmacist is right there. Mm-hmm. But is there interaction in the commercial space? Because personally, I've never been like, hey, let me call that pharmacist at Walgreens, be like, hey, can you give me information on this, right? And I've never had them even question a prescription. I had this one, And it was like a patient who was on testosterone, and I had to put him on an estrogen blocker and an anastrozole. And the pharmacist, it was weird. Like, she called me like, hey, why are you giving this man a breast cancer medication? I was like, what? Like, get off my phone. Like, just fill the prescription, lady. I didn't say that, right? So he explained it, but is there any communication or kind of interaction between that commercial pharmacist and physicians?
Oh, yeah.
Right.
I mean, they're legally required to perform what's called drug utilization review on every prescription that they receive. So they evaluate the prescription for that patient to make sure that there's no drug disease interactions, if it's too early, too late, the dose is too high, too low, all of those kind of things. So a medication that's only FDA approved for use in women, triggering a pharmacist when it's prescribed to a man is appropriate.
Right.
That is probably typically a new pharmacist or a young pharmacist that hasn't, been around the block. Like, you've seen it a couple of times. You're not going to call on every single anastrozole script that you get for a man that's dosed it once a week. You're like, oh, I've seen this before. Right. When I was a new pharmacist, I got a prescription actually written for testosterone from a naturopathic doctor when I worked at a corporate retail pharmacy. And I was, called them. I didn't even realize, because I'd just moved to Arizona, that naturopathic physicians had any prescribing authority, let alone for controlled substances. So, and when I've worked at those kind of pharmacies, you'll call on prescriptions all the time, like, this dose seems too high, this dose seems too low, especially you're extra vigilant with medications for children, medications for the elderly, because those are the patients at greatest risk for drug-related adverse events.
Okay. Well, I guess it's good that I haven't got a phone call from the commercial pharmacist, because, if it's like, hey, like, wait a minute, you have this 70-year-old lady, why are you putting her on 180 milligrams of MP thyroid? Now, that should get a phone call on that, right? Certain things like that. But thankfully, we haven't, right?
But yes, they're required to do that too. So, I mean, it probably just means that none of your prescribing is raising any eyebrows.
I try not to raise eyebrows. It's kind of like I should put that on the front door. Dr. Greg Jones, I don't raise eyebrows. That's how we stay in business. And so the other thing you kind of mentioned was like that, and I really want to get into this a little bit later. This is going to be the fun part, talking about like 503A and 503B and what compound pharmacies can do. But as a segue, you kind of mentioned like, hey, there's a strength not available or a dosage form not available, right? Is there free range on that? As in, hypothetically, let's just say for the sake of this conversation, is like, we mentioned MP thyroid, right? Like a thyroid medication, right? And it's like, hey, the thyroid medication, like, oh my God, this patient can't swallow this at all, whatever like that. And I want to do it as like a dropper or a tincture, or I want to do it a different way, right? And obviously you got to look at the absorption and all that. Yeah. But if you have that case where it's like a dosage form or a dosage strength, is there free range to do whatever's necessary? Is there a limit on what you can and can't do?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Absolutely. There's lots of limits. Pharmacy is a highly regulated industry, and compounding pharmacy is even more highly regulated. When a pharmacist receives a prescription for a compounded product, there's a whole kind of chain of questions they have to answer about it to make sure that it meets all of the criteria for them to make it. So I always started with, can I make this? So this is going to be a lot of things, but the first thing that you think of is, does the active pharmaceutical ingredient meet the criteria for compounding? And to determine if it does, the FDA says it either has to have a USP or NF monograph, or be part of an FDA-approved product, or be on the list, the bulks list, or the positive list that's been published by the FDA. FDA was directed by Congress in 1997 to publish this positive list that has not been done. FDA instead has made interim bulks lists. And those are called Category 1, Category 2, and Category 3. Compounding pharmacists are allowed to compound with things that exist on Category 1, and that's the things that some of your people might be familiar with, like glutathione and methylcobalamin, quercetin. Those are on Category 1. Without that Category 1 interim list, we wouldn't be able to compound with those items. Category 2 is items that the FDA has received information or nominations from industry stakeholders about these items, and the FDA has determined that the evidence doesn't support the safe or effective use of those medications. So recently, 17 peptides were just moved to category
20.
We're just moved to category 2 by the FDA. So those are things that were nominated, that the FDA said were nominated with enough evidence, and the FDA has made the determination that they're not safe or effective. Category 3 are nominations that the FDA has received that they haven't been received with enough evidence for FDA to determine their safety and effectiveness. Pharmacies can technically compound with Category 3 products as long as they're not an active ingredient. So a lot of times doctors will write things with hyaluronic acid in them or in sesame oil. Those things are surprisingly in Category 3. So they can be in the compounded product. We all know that, testosterone's in sesame oil and hyaluronic acid is added to a lot of vaginal creams, but those are inactive ingredients or excipients in those products rather than labeled active ingredients. So that's the categories, does it meet these criteria, USPA monograph, FDA-approved product, or Category 1. Also, pharmacies can't compound what's deemed an essential copy. So we can't make a copy of an FDA-approved product unless certain conditions are met. So if a product exists on the FDA's drug shortage list, compounding pharmacies are able to step in and kind of fill in that gap. And that's what's happening recently with compounded semaglutide.
I was just about to say that. So semaglutide and the tirzepatide.
Semaglutide and tirzepatide have been on the drug shortage list for quite a long time, which has opened up compounding pharmacies to be able to compound those and meet prescriber and patient need and demand for those products. So that's kind of like, can I compound it legally? But then you also have to think of, should I compound it? So sometimes you'll get prescriptions for just wacky doses or combinations that don't make any sense or things that doctors want that aren't possible. Like some things are not water soluble. I can't make this into a solution, or I can't make this into an injection, or this is only stable at a pH of 2. It's going to burn super bad if we inject this into a person. So you have to think about all of those kind of kinetic, pharmacotherapy kind of decisions, as well as the legal aspect of whether you can use something in a compounded product or not.
Okay. Great. Now, I was going to do this a little bit later, but we dove into the waters of Category 1, 2, and 3. And so this one, we were kind of talking before we started, like, how do we explain this to people, right? And I was like, okay, and from understanding, like for me, I was like, okay, Category 1, which is kind of was that like the green zone?
Yeah,
it's green, right?
Green zone is good.
It's
with some caveats.
Right. So it's okay to compound. So, okay, here's a question. If you're Category 1, it's okay to compound. Is that a permanent green light, or is that still under review?
No. So some of the items in category, so the FDA has what's called a Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee. And that's a committee of independent experts that essentially advise the FDA on what to do. Right. The FDA doesn't have to listen to them. So the advisory committee can say, we think that this should be allowed to be used in compounding. The FDA can say, no thanks, we don't want to do that. Okay. But there are some things that the advisory committee has said they don't think should be included in the permanent bulks list when it's published, but the FDA has not finalized those substances. So for a substance to be finalized, it has to be published in the Federal Register, and then it's like typically 60 days or so from when it's published in the Federal Register when it actually goes into law. Right. So there's some items that have been voted down by the PCAC that are used commonly in compounded products now, like NAD, quercetin. Those things are going to, levocarnitine, I think is one of them, are going to go away when they're published in the Federal Register by the FDA. There are things that have been essentially affirmed by the PCAC committee, like methacobalamin, for example. So methacobalamin is one that the PCAC committee has said, yes, we think that this should be included in the final bulks list. There's some kind of nuance with things like methacobalamin and glutathione too, because the FDA is they've made the determination that they don't think that dietary supplement USP monographs are appropriate to be used in a compounded product. So the United States Pharmacopoeia makes monographs for drug products and dietary supplement products. They don't make those monographs any different, but the FDA has determined that dietary supplement monographs are not the same. What that means in practice is that most things like methacobalamin have a dietary supplement monograph, or say like taurine. They have a dietary supplement monograph instead of a drug monograph. So when possible, right now, compounding pharmacies should be using pharma grade on those products, especially if they're making them in injectables.
Right.
But not all of those exist in a pharma grade. So I haven't seen any action taken by the FDA yet on this dietary supplement issue. It is a published opinion of theirs. They go in and inspect compounding pharmacies for cause or for surveillance, and they issue essentially observations of their inspection. It's called a Form 483. Okay. It's usually, things the pharmacy could improve upon. Mm-hmm. And I've not seen them issue any 483s that include the dietary supplement issue, so it's not been, say, fully adjudicated by a court. But where, FDA would issue a 483, the pharmacy would protest that, and it would eventually go to court if they went all the way. So we'll see what happens with those things. But there are things on the positive list that are voted up that are dietary supplements. So they kind of fall into this gray area too.
Yeah, and so speaking of sad, because you mentioned some of the things that, like personally my patients, I know a lot of people possibly listening and watching, is like NAD has been a game changer for a lot of people, and L-carnitine for people with weight loss and even liver issues, and even just athletes, right?
Yeah.
And so you mentioned like the protest. Is it like, hey, as a patient, as a clinician, even as a pharmacist that's seeing the benefits from this, is there a chance to say, hey, this should, we want to push back, this should not get removed from the list? Like, is there a pathway to do that?
So the FDA has a docket. All this process for creating laws, it's kind of fascinating and complicated. Mm-hmm. But so they publish what's called an open docket or a public docket on regulations.gov, and anyone can submit comments to the 503A open docket. So about substances related to use in compounding, et cetera. Recently, we kind of talked on this peptide issue. A health center in Texas filed a lawsuit against the FDA, claiming that they haven't done their due diligence. Congress directed them to create this positive list in 1997. They've not done it. Mm-hmm. So they filed a lawsuit against FDA about that issue, and then also including 4 of those kind of peptides that we've been talking about, with evidence about those peptides that maybe wasn't appropriately evaluated by the FDA.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll see what happens with that lawsuit, but there's a couple different pathways people can go down, but it's a very government-centric pathway.
Yeah, it's bureaucracy, it's paperwork, there's lobbying, there's a lot of factors that go into it, and I think sometimes even as the public, the patient, the physician, sometimes it's like it feels like, I don't say like helpless, man, but it's just like, hey, there's a law, even just like something in the city level. It's like, hey, you can go to your representative, you can go to your congresspeople, you can keep doing it. But I think the thing is I think it's not good to say don't try.
Yeah.
Right. And so if there's an open docket, if there's a lawsuit, if there's a petition, it's important for people to be a part of it, especially if you have evidence. Like for me, I can say, hey, I have all these patients that this is what this product does. This is what the product did. Here's all the safe times I've used it. I've never had this side effect and all that stuff, or this is how we manage it. So I think it's good to know that there is a way to, I don't use the word push back, but at least say something about it. And you may have the right person, and enough people say it, there may be some changes, right? So it's tough,
Kind of outside of this issue, FDA, I don't know if you've heard about the NASM report that the FDA said that they were going to use as a determination for compounded hormones. So the FDA had the National Institute of Health commission NASM to do a report on compounded hormones. Mm-hmm. So they did that, and the results of their report were released in, I think, July of 2020. And basically, they only evaluated a small fraction of the studies that were available about compounded hormones, and predictably said that compounded hormones couldn't be proven to be safe and effective. Which is kind of obviously, compounded hormones are typically done as an N of 1 patient-specific medication. So you can't take an N of 1 and do a double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial. You can't prove that. So we've created a website, my organization. It's called compounding.com. So it's really easy to remember. If you go on compounding.com, there's a lot of information about protecting access to compounded hormones. And then there's a place for patients and providers to submit their stories about how this therapy changed their life. And you can sort them by state, and you can actually send them and send a letter to your representative by putting in your zip code, your address. It'll make a letter for you.
Oh,
so compounded hormones are, even outside of this issue, like a whole other access issue for compounded drugs. But that's another way to make your voice heard. Right. We know that compounded hormones are very important and very commonly used in people's lives, especially women patients that are going through menopause. And if those were taken away as an option, the public outcry would be enormous, right. Which is why this compounding.com website exists to help put those stories out there, because all we have when we don't have double-blind placebo-controlled trials is patient-reported outcomes. Right. And if patients and enough patients are reporting positive outcomes, then we're hoping that someone has to listen.
Okay, so personal experiences, like when I first, got into practice and found out about compound pharmacies, I quickly had to learn, because this is not a thing that's taught in med school, the difference between a 503A and B. And again, it's just like 503 what and A and B. And so then I was okay, 503A is for the patient, 503B is office use. That was like the simple way to put it, right?
Yeah.
But for a clinician who doesn't know, or even a patient, when you hear your doctor say, or even just read something that talks about 503A and B, what's the difference?
Sure. Well, it all started in 2013 when the Congress wrote the Drug Quality and Security Act. Mm-hmm. And they did that in response to a tragic, deadly fungal outbreak that happened due to inappropriately compounded drugs from a Massachusetts compounding pharmacy. So they created these two categories of compounding organizations. So 503A pharmacies are what you would think of traditional pharmacies. Almost every pharmacy in the country you could consider a 503A pharmacy, because they could fill a compounded prescription for a patient. Even our Walgreens or CVS, could mix two creams together and create a compound. So they technically would be a 503A pharmacy. 503A pharmacies can only fill patient-specific prescriptions. They also have limits on what's called anticipatory compounding. So obviously, it's way more convenient to write a prescription for a compound and have the patient go down and pick it up and leave that day. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, because they're so specialized, most of the time there's some turnaround for the pharmacy to prepare the product. And the things that are commonly prescribed, pharmacies can prepare in advance, but they have limits. So they can typically only prepare 30 days worth of their historical dispensing history of a compound in that anticipatory compounding. So if you call your local mom and pop pharmacy and ask them to send you a pound of BLT to your office, they should say no. They can only fill patient-specific prescriptions. Right. Congress created in 503Bs a whole new category of compounder, and that's called an outsourcing facility. So it's somewhere between a compounding pharmacy and a drug manufacturer. So unlike 503A compounding pharmacies that are state regulated and typically have to follow USP guidelines on compounding, 503Bs have to follow CGMP, which stands for Current Good Manufacturing Practices, the same as a drug manufacturer. They also have to be registered with the FDA, typically also have to be permitted or registered in the state that they're in, and they are doing things at a lot larger scale. They're allowed to make huge batches of typically sterile medications that are allowed to be sent to drug clinics, hospitals for administration. So they are very important in the shortage drug compounding space, because one of the things that they're allowed to do, they have a positive list just like 503As do, and they can also help with things on shortage. 503A pharmacies are a little bit more nimble because they're smaller, and the requirements that they have to follow are a little less stringent. So when something becomes on shortage, 503As are usually able to step in first and fill those patient-specific prescriptions. while 503Bs are doing stability studies and all of that testing that's going to be required of them to bring that product to market. If you've been in a hospital and had lidocaine injections or a bicarb injection, a lot of those are coming from 503Bs because those drugs have been kind of on the shortage list for on and off for quite a while. So they're bigger than a 503A, and they're allowed to compound for office use. If you need to stock a compounded product for administration in your office, it's better to source it from a 503B because you don't have to then send a patient prescription in and wait for that to get shipped to you. You can treat the patient the same day you see them, if you've got it already there.
Right. So that's great because you mentioned semaglutide. I know there's a few pharmacies I've seen, they've sent emails to the clinic, like these pharmacies I've seen is like, hey, we got semaglutide and it's 503B now, right? Like, what? When did that happen, right? And so obviously because it's on the drug shortage list, right? So how does a drug graduate or a medication or an injectable graduate from 503A to B? So like say B12, like B12 is pretty common. I've seen a lot 503A for the most part, but there are pharmacies that are doing like total methylcobalamin or cyanocobalamin and 503B for office use, right? And so is it just a shortage thing? Because I don't think there's been ever shortage. I've never seen a shortage of B12.
No,
it's just how much people use,
I think
right?
methylcobalamin exists on list 1 of the FDA's 503B bulks list, I believe. Don't quote me on that. I'm not as familiar with 503B regs as I am with 503A. But essentially the market has to exist before the 503Bs are going to invest the money to bring those to market because it's expensive to do things like stability studies for them, to bring a whole new product line. These are huge kind of factory almost pharmacies. So to bring something to market is an expensive proposition. So there has to be the market that exists. Right. Last summer, FDA published a kind of new draft guidance on what's called 503B wholesaling. Essentially, what the effect of this draft guidance is that 503Bs are allowed to sell to 503As for redispensing. Not all states have taken that position because this is draft guidance from the FDA. It's not final law. But that is coming, and a lot of states have adopted that draft guidance and said that's allowed. What that will do is expand the market to things like semaglutide because, as we know, 503A pharmacies, there's not as many that do sterile compounding as that do non-sterile compounding. But if the non-sterile compounders can order semaglutide from a 503B for dispensing from their pharmacy, the market is going to explode even more than it already has.
Oh, it really will. It really will. So that's a good point to kind of clarify there is you mentioned sterile compounding and non-sterile compounding. What's the difference?
Well, so sterile compounding has to be sterile. So it has to be free from any microbial contamination that would make someone sick. So anything that's used internally in the body must be sterile. So injectables, eye drops, irrigations meant for internal body tissues, bladder installations, all of those things have to be sterile so they don't introduce bacteria, pathogens into a patient's body. Non-sterile compounding is everything else. So capsules, creams, troches, lotions, lozenges, nasal sprays, eardrops, all of those are considered external. They don't need to be sterile. They have rules and requirements to make sure that they're, I don't want to say clean. That's probably not the right word, but the same as manufacturers do. There's requirements that they have to follow when you buy lotion at the store that make sure that it's appropriate and is not going to be damaging for you to use.
Right, but no one's... So like say for capsules, right? Because I'm like, wait a minute, I use capsules inside. We're swallowing those, right?
Yeah.
But
our GI tract is actually considered external.
Well, I mean, that's debatable. It's inside the body, right?
Yeah, because it has an opening and an end.
Right. Gotcha. But I guess a good pharmacist is going to make sure that they're not given endotoxin-laced capsules, right? That's just not smart, right?
Yeah.
So it's just...
But if they did, it wouldn't hurt anybody. So endotoxins obviously are not something that we want to put in people's bodies. Right. There's a limit of how many endotoxins a patient can tolerate without it causing any issues. But endotoxins in an intramuscular injection are far less dangerous than endotoxins in an IV or especially an intrathecal injection.
Right.
But if you swallowed something that was full of endotoxins, I bet your stomach would
We would hope.
break it down.
I
Yeah.
hope.
Yeah.
I hope. I mean, unless you're treating them for gut health.
Yeah.
And then it's just like, oh shit, I just made that worse. I should have cleaned these troches.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to circle back to, or actually I kind of want to summarize that 503A and B, and I think you kind of hit the big point. So 503A, patient specific.
Patient specific.
Limited quantities, no anticipatory compounding.
Yep. Limited anticipatory
A
content.
little bit if you're
Yeah.
like, hey, I do 1,000, prescriptions of lidothioronine,
low-dose
naltrexone, so I
whatever.
can make
Yeah.
what you can't go over. This is, where you go with that. The 503As, are they regulated by the state or federal?
So 503A pharmacies are primarily regulated by state boards of pharmacy.
Okay.
That doesn't mean the FDA doesn't regulate them either.
Right.
But so how we usually describe it is FDA regulates the products used in and prepared by 503A compounding pharmacies. So 503A pharmacies have all of these criteria that they have to go through to make sure that the API or active pharmaceutical ingredient they're going to use in a compound is appropriate, meets the guidelines. So and it has to be that manufacturer has to be registered with the FDA. All of those are the products used in compounding, and the FDA regulates the products that the pharmacy makes, their final products.
Right.
The practice of pharmacy, so everything in between, we say is regulated by the Board of Pharmacy.
Okay.
And the Board of Pharmacy's job is to protect the public in the state that they live in. That doesn't mean FDA doesn't go in and inspect 503As, because they do. We know they do on the regular. But the primary regulator is the State Board of Pharmacy.
Okay. And 503B is more federally regulated as well. And so obviously, and going to 503B is bigger facilities, larger scale production. They sounds like they're kind of held to the same standard as like a pharmaceutical company and what they're producing, right?
They're held to CGMP, which is the same standard
okay.
as pharmaceutical manufacturers.
Okay, gotcha. All right. Again, even our offices, we don't do a ton of it just because a lot of pharmacies we work with just don't like testosterone is like the biggest office use one, right? So hey, come get your TRT injection, makes it easier. And I actually kind of like that a little bit more divergent. It's like, hey, you're coming here to get the injection, so it's not like here's a vial, which I thought was like the weirdest thing. I always thought that was weird. Here's a vial of testosterone, which is like, yeah, don't screw this up. Don't take too much or do whatever. So I think there's some benefit in doing things office use as well.
Oh, yeah.
So just from
anything administered in the office, get it from a 503B if possible.
Right, yeah.
But I mean, plenty of patients self-administer testosterone at home.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But if you were going to do the shots, you should stock it for office use.
Oh yeah, definitely, 100%. And again, I know it sounds like, oh my God, I sound like I don't trust anyone. Actually, I don't trust anyone. But I will say that at the end of the day, it's just like, well, you're making sure that, hey, like here's a dose I want you to do, and then you just have that conversation with the patient. But sometimes in office use, you have a little bit more like, hey, this is the dose here, because I think sometimes it's easy. Again, I guess I can say that could be anything, right? It's like, hey, I told you to take 30 milligrams MP thyroid. Like, I don't feel good. I took 2 of them, right? Anyone can do that, right?
Yeah.
It's just a matter of like explaining, here's what happens if you do too much of this, right?
It's maybe a little more common with testosterone than NP thyroid. But yeah, you have the right point. And I've seen a lot of testosterone guys like to share it with their friends at the gym and stuff.
No way.
Yeah.
No, they don't. There's no way. No.
We don't want them doing that.
It's highly frowned upon,
yes,
if you will. So this is cool because we got through 503A, talked about the categories, and so I kind of want to close the loop on that category stuff too, just because, especially with the peptide stuff. So if I'm understanding, category 2 is just like, hey, don't compound this. Not safe, not enough evidence, ineffective, unnecessary kind of thing. So don't do it, right? Now, that being said, these regulations are, and again, I'm going to a little bit of devil's advocate because I love peptides, right?
Yeah.
And let's just say, this is saying don't compound it, right? And so, but it's not saying don't prescribe it.
Exactly.
But technically, if you tell the compound pharmacist not to make it, you're telling the doctors not to prescribe it. It's an indirect slap on the hand or slap in the face, depending on how you want to do it, right?
Yeah.
How you want to take it, right? But
yes. Yeah, we've always said that. Peptides are powerful medicines. I don't think that peptides are inappropriate to use in patients. But now that they've been moved to category 2, and even previous to that, they technically never met the criteria to be used in a compounded product. So CJC or whatever doesn't have a USP monograph. It's not a part of an FDA-approved product. Doesn't appear on list 1. I know, however, that a lot of doctors have had great success with peptides. What we need is maybe some of these peptides to be renominated with better evidence. And that's the thing that's hard with compounded products, we know, is that it's hard to get appropriate evidence that would be enough evidence to tell the FDA that these are safe and effective. But that's kind of the only path that I can see that we can go down is to get these peptides moved. I mean, it's crazy to me, too, that they were moved to Category 2. We know that all of the big players that I know of, at least, have at this point stopped making the peptides. So, but you can still go to your health food store and buy these oral versions of all these peptides.
I'm so glad you brought this up. Yeah. Now, I've been waiting to talk to a pharmacist about this for a very long time, and I feel like I got the right person to talk to this about. And this is the frustration as a provider. The FDA is saying, hey, these 20 peptides, which somehow I call it the most arbitrary correct list, because these are probably the 20 most effective, most used peptides that are really helping people, right? You're saying, hey, they're going to Category 2. Not say stop making them, right? But yet, if I Google BPC 157, I'm going to find 20 websites selling them to anyone that can buy them on Amazon for research only. You can just go buy it, put some sterile water in it, bacteriostatic water, inject it. And they're not going after these people, but they're going after the pharmacies that are doing it right. Well, how do you explain that?
They are going after those people, but those companies, I mean, those illegal drug sales are a lot harder for the FDA to find because
they're on they're on the webs, they're on the internet.
There's so many of them.
Right.
I mean, I've seen warning letters that the FDA have sent to these companies, but they just reopen because they don't have like a storefront. Like
they can't get rated. Right.
So they just open in another name. So it's kind of a game of whack-a-mole to try to keep those companies at bay, but it's the same. There's a lot of that with the GLP-1s too, research grade, and all of that is not compounding. That's illegal online drug sales. But it's scary for you because you as a prescriber want your patient to use these products, but you can't legally prescribe them. A pharmacy can't legally dispense them. But then if they were to order it online, I would assume against your best judgment and wishes, then you would be worried about what's in it, like how are they dosing it? Is it even sterile? All of those kind of questions. You know, we've heard recently about the tons of patients that have been sickened with counterfeit Botox, and that's a whole other issue. But like we don't even know what's in these things. It could seriously injure patients.
Right. You know, when the Category 2 list came out and when they had the peptides on there, right? The first thing I said, I was like, have we never heard of prohibition? Because if you take something away that people want or use and there's a market for it, these online sales, you're just going to drive them
towards the illegal
to
market.
Doing that. It's literally what happened in 1919. I hope I got that year right. Google in front of me, right? And so we had a whole thing, right? You know, and it became a thing where it's like, okay, we need to make them. And I'm not saying peptides are not going to go by the way of Al Capone. We know that, right? There's not going to be shootouts in the street over BPC 157, you know? But at the same time, the concept is the same. It's like, hey, this really helped me. I can't get it from my doctor. I went online, my buddy did it, and I got 20 different options on where to get it. And these people are going to buy this stuff and put themselves at harm's way. So I think there has to be a middle ground, maybe with the lawsuits, maybe with advocacy, where it's like we need to do this the right way and figure out how do we get these things off of Category 2 and Category 1, right? And that's the big question, right, is how do you – that takes a lot of money.
It takes a lot of money and organization because, I mean – we're all running around trying to take care of our own patients and like getting the time and space and energy to band together to try to, get these things done is quite a lot of work for the advocacy. But like I said, this lawsuit was just filed, that some different players banded together and got the money together to file this lawsuit. But those are great things to do. It doesn't always work, In 2020, when HCG was moved to a biologic,
I remember that.
I partnered with several other compounding pharmacies, and we, wrote a letter that was written by a lawyer on our behalf, and we had a lot of testimony from different providers that were writing prescriptions and how much it changed their patients. But it doesn't always work, but you gotta keep trying.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. It's frustrating, but again, it's just you have to adapt and try to figure out how we can help patients. Because at the end of the day, it's about helping the patient. Right? That's the end goal is to how can I provide something that's helping people that, hey, they're doing the peptides potentially because supplements didn't work or they don't want to do the medications, they got side effects from the medications, right? So I think finding that middle ground is the thing to do. So this actually leads me to a question I wanted to make sure I ask you because, so it seems like you mentioned all these years. You went, I think it's at 97, 2013, there's 2023, right?
Yep.
The landscape is always changing, right? And as a physician, like they promulgate these guidances and you're just like, I don't know what this means because it's written in pharmacy language, right? So this is more directed for like the clinicians that, the practitioners that are listening and watching this. How do we navigate that? Like, how do you understand what I can and can't do?
I think the best thing that a clinician can do is to have a relationship with a local compounding pharmacist. Those relationships are important because you can call up and be like, hey, I have this patient and this problem. That pharmacist loves to help solve those problems. That's their entire job. And they can help walk you through these kind of things. I mean, you have no idea how many text messages I got when peptides were moved to Category 2 from all providers like you that reached out to me because I have those relationships with them to say, oh no, what do I do? But I think having those relationships is helpful for many, many different reasons. Right. There's national associations. So there's ANH, which is the Alliance for Natural Health. There's the Arizona Naturopathic Medical Association. All of those kind of things can be resources to keep you updated as to the changing landscape. Right. And we all know things happen quickly, but they also don't. So, like, peptides were moved to Category 2, but that doesn't mean that on October 1st, all peptides went away instantly. Right. It's kind of a gradual thing where the news starts spreading around and everyone starts saying, how am I going to react to this? What am I going to do? Yeah. I guess try to not be too freaked out. I've been in the compounding industry for 20 years and it's always something. So, right. The regulations always are changing. We have something that's a really hot commodity and then it goes away, but then we find something else that's really important for patients because we are never going to stop innovating and growing and trying to help our patients.
That's a good point. Great point. Never stop learning. Never stop growing. Never stop believing.
That's right.
That's right. I feel like there's a song that talks about that. And so here's something cool. So you mentioned you've been doing this for like 20 years, right? And so technology changes too, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so I'll tell you what, I'm so glad because like when I first started, it's like, oh, you got to write, I was expecting a script pad, right? Yep. You're like, oh man, that's like the doctor thing. It's like, oh, I got my own prescription pad. It was like, oh, I got this. You see, you're growing up, your doc writes a script, you take the piece of paper to the pharmacist, you do all this stuff here, but now there's no script pads. I didn't get a script pad.
Well, you can order your own.
I don't want a script pad, right? I don't want extra writing, right?
Yeah.
And so the technology is growing and it's advancing. So how do you see technology reshaping compound pharmacies in the future based on what you've seen and what you see coming?
So I think that more automation is coming. I think that more remote work is coming, so where pharmacists are able to supervise technicians compounding, like rather than being in the room with them, they're able to see them on camera and things like that are coming. The prescribing software has come a long way where you can electronically send prescriptions to compounding pharmacies, but what would be great is if I could send you a note back because a lot of times if I have a question on something, I have to call on it because it's not really like a two-way messaging system. Not, right. I think that would be something that would be nice to work towards in the future. Mm-hmm. Any collaboration between healthcare practitioners, any way to get us kind of closer, will eventually always help our patients, but we don't know what AI is going to do as far as medicine. So there's a lot of kind of question marks in the horizon. Right.
You made a good point about the two-way thing because there have been times where I've sent prescriptions to a compound pharmacy and they use I don't know if Civic Center use LifeFile. That's like the one most pharmacies use. And I get it because you're busy. It's like you're how many pharmacists for how many patients, and you put a prescription in and there's like, hey, there's an issue, there's a question. They can call you. They'll just put question or problem with order and you won't see it until you're like, wait, where's the patient's medication? You go, oh my God, this came a week ago and no one told me.
Yeah.
And I used to kind of be like, why did anyone call me? They're just like, dude, we're busy too, And it's not like intentional, but the expectation is that you're going to follow up on it. You'll see the note, but it'd be great if you get an email or a notification like, hey, there's an issue with your prescription. So to anyone who designs software for pharmacies, I think there's money to be made there. Yeah. There is not so much money to be made, there's a difference to be made, right? So hopefully someone can innovate that.
If we could go back and forth, and then it would be so much easier for us to get clarification on things.
Shouldn't be that bad.
prescribing controlled substances, especially compounded controlled substances, is really hard for physicians. And you guys have to build it correctly in your system, and most of you don't know how to do that. And so there's always the problem that it's not a legal e-script. And so,
There's a lot. And then the one we use has like a two-factor authentication where it's like you got to get a code on your, so it's kind of like, like everything's two-factor authentication now, where it's like, I try to buy something, I get a code. Like, I just want to buy these shoes. Why do I have to give you a code, right? It's just, preventing, because there's people doing all kind of fraudulent stuff out there. So we kind of need that to make sure it's you, which I totally understand that. So it's just pain in the ass.
It is.
Right now I'm just complaining. All right. So this has been great. I mean, this was educational for me, and I hope that, the patients listening and the doctors listening can kind of understand, like, hey, this is what it means when I send something to a compound pharmacy. And we want to get more education on what we can and can't do, right? Because I almost feel like y'all like genies. You can make whatever. It's like, hey, why don't you do this? You can do this, right? And understanding that you can. But again, it's just depending on that. So I think we hit the main points. We hit like commercial versus clinical versus compounding pharmacy. Retail falls in that commercial thing. We hit like, hey, what is 503A versus 503B? The categories, what this means. And I think we kind of hit all the things. I think people learned a lot.
Yep. If people want to learn more about compounding, they can go to compounding.com. We've got a lot of resources on that website to help you learn about the hormone issue as well as other compounding advocacy issues. And
all right.
Yeah, happy to be a resource. Thanks for having me.
If, how do people find more about you and your work in the advocacy world?
Sure. They can email me if they have questions or need help with anything. My email is my name, Tanille, Tenille, at the4pc.org. So the Alliance for Pharmacy Compounding.
Okay. We'll put that in the notes. Okay, so I'll put an asterisk down there in the notes, hey, to make sure that these, have some discretion with your questions. This doesn't randomly say, like, hey, what can I do about, testosterone or a different peptide, right? So make sure the question is good. So I want you to get good questions.
Thank you.
I feel like I have good listeners, so you shouldn't get any silly questions. I might ask you some silly stuff.
You can always ask me questions.
That's just me. So everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm so excited that I finally got Tanille here to learn about compounding pharmacies and how it can help you as a patient and you as a practitioner. For more information, check out the notes. Tanille will have that down here. But hey, until next time, we'll talk more, and then we'll keep talking some more after that. All right, have a good day, y'all.
Thanks.